Good morning. Welcome to the Eastman Financial Report. I'm Dan Eastman, your host, and today is Monday, February 2nd, 2026. Thank you so much for tuning in. As always, we appreciate your viewership here at the Eastman Financial Report. Apologize for being absent for a week, but with the amazing weather we've had in the United States, at least in the central part, it was quite a challenge. But we're back and we're broadcasting live, and we're broadcasting theoretically 11:30 to 12 Central Time, Monday through Friday, from the great metropolis of the city of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. However, I'm on the road today. Therefore the change in background. But it is good to have you back, and it's good to be back because there's always news, and it's an amazing thing when you're absent for a week, how much news piles up, especially financial news. So we're going to go and sort through all of that today and figure out where we sit with our amazing American economy and our global economy. But I did want to thank you for, of course, watching not only the Eastman Financial Report, but also all of the fine programming you see on worldviewtube.com and, of course, here at Worldview Radio throughout the day. As you know, we're a Christian broadcasting network, and it's our ministry, our mission, our passion, our goal, and our desire to bring to the great marketplace of ideas a worldview from a Christian perspective. And that's what we do. We do that all day long on this network. And of course, I do it from the financial and economic perspective on this program. But throughout the day, you will see Christian broadcasting and you will see the news and information of the day from that Christian perspective. And it's so very important that we continue doing this. And of course, we do this free of charge. If you notice, you're not paying a subscription or a paywall to watch the Eastman Financial Report or any of the programming you see throughout the day on WVW TV or worldviewtube.com, because this is our ministry and this is our gift freely given. Just like the apostles 2,000 years ago, going about the Middle East, spreading the good news of the gospel, they weren't charging. It wasn't some sort of an entertainment venue. It was giving that message free. And we continue to do that today until the second coming, because it's very important that we keep that Christian worldview front and center in an ever expanding marketplace of ideas. And if you know, there's a lot of choices out there today. If you want to watch media, there's just anyone with a microphone and a camera can certainly contribute to that great marketplace of ideas. And while that's an important thing, because the bigger the marketplace, the more robust, the more information, the better off all of the consumers of information are. But we want to keep our message alive and we want to keep it fresh. And you can help us in that process very easily. You can go to worldviewfoundation.com and make a donation. And we appreciate that because, as you know, if we can keep our ministry in the black, as they say, we will be able to continue broadcasting throughout this year with free of charge, no paywall. So if you go to the Worldview Found or WVW Foundation or worldviewfoundation.com, it's at the bottom of the screen. It'll take you right to the website. You can make a one-time donation, or you can sign up for a monthly donation, and that has the added economic benefit of flattening our revenue curve so that we can better match cost to revenues, and that keeps us online free of charge. So we really appreciate it. You can also use the convenient QR code you see at the bottom of the screen. You can also help us out by doing business with the vendors you see advertising throughout the day on our network. We don't sell blocks of advertising time like commercial networks do. Rather, we partner with companies we know and trust so that when you do business with them, know that a small portion of those proceeds comes back to us in the form of a commission. And that also helps us keep this ministry fresh and current and alive and free of charge. There's one more thing you can do, and we have a new service. I've been talking about this for a couple of months already. It's worldviewtube.com/vault. If you go to worldviewtube.com/vault, right here on the bottom of the screen, you can subscribe to our vault. Now, there's a little paywall there, but that subscription really helps us in this ministry. And what's inside the vault, well, what would you think? You'd put valuable things in a vault, right? And that's exactly what you'll find in our vault. If you think about it, Brandon Howes has been doing this ministry since 2006, and he's written 15 books. He's had conferences, events, and seminars for over 20 years, and all of that information is digitally recorded and it lives in the vault. So if you are looking for a way to find access to wonderful scripturally based material, subscribing to the vault is a really good thing. Sometimes maybe you're struggling in your faith or your anxieties of the day are overwhelming. it's not a bad idea to have in your collection a library that's as well equipped as the vault. You can log in real time on demand, and you can see some great Christian programming. It's very spiritually uplifting, and it's a nice feature to have. So when you get one of those days where you really need a little help in the spiritual realm, that is a wonderful thing to have access to. And also keep in mind, if you subscribe to a subscription for a friend or a relative who's struggling, that's an amazing gift because how do you help somebody that is in need of help? Well, buy them something or sit and talk to them or have coffee or this and that. But if you subscribe to the vault and give that to them as a gift, then they have 12 months of access to some very, very scripturally based and spiritually uplifting information, and that can be very important in people's lives. So think about that. Subscribe to the vault for yourself, for a little boost, and also think of those who are struggling, and maybe this would be just the gift that helps them through. Well, so that's how you can help. You can make a donation. You can do business with the vendors on our network, and of course, you can subscribe to the vault, and you can do all three, and that's great because it keeps us robust and in this great marketplace of ideas, which is exactly where we need to be in this day and age. We live in a very turbulent time, in a very frightening time, not only with the deterioration of the human situation, but also the increasing importance of the digital situation and artificial intelligence and all of these new modern pressures. It's good to have a spiritual basis and a spiritual grounding, and that's why this stuff is really important. So give it some thought. I'd like to talk about the news. Of course, it's been a week off, and what a week it's been. There's lots of information to be shared, and of course, again today, the government is shut down. It's not really shut down. The government never shuts down. It can't shut down, but we'll say it's shut down because that's what the media wants you to believe. The big government shutdown. Only it's sort of partial this time. But when I was broadcasting 2 weeks ago, I didn't think they would do that because I thought after the heat they took from the November-December shutdown, which was 43 days, it was the longest in history, and it just once again demonstrates the irrelevance of the American Congress. This is a concept that was probably a great idea in 1776, a great idea in 1789. But it has demonstrated again and again and again that this Congress of the United States, with its inability to match spending to its tax power and revenues, simply is broken. And this is another example. And of course, in Congress, they're trying to limit the damage because this is like Peter and the wolf. You cry wolf until there's no wolf. And then someday the wolf comes, but nobody believes you. Well, Congress has long since passed that wonderful fairy tale. Nobody believes anything in Congress. When we look at how these people go into Washington with no concept of revenue base, which is our tax base, and Americans dutifully pay their taxes. And we're coming up on April 15th in a couple of months, and we'll all be paying our taxes because that's what we do as American citizens. But it doesn't matter because the money that goes in, and that's $5 trillion this year in tax revenues, they'll spend $7.5 trillion and they'll borrow the rest. And just go and borrow the rest. And that's why we have $38.5 trillion in debt, soon to be $39 trillion in debt. And it never stops. It just never stops. There's no responsibility. And we watch these pathetic political games that we're not going to pass the budget unless you give us this, and we're in the minority and we're in the majority and we can't govern. And it's sad. It really is sad. We think about an American culture that is so wonderfully powerful and so wonderfully brilliant, so wonderfully talented on a global basis. And then we look at the people who govern us. And it's our own fault. We send these people to Washington. And this is what we get. This is what we get. We get 38.5 trillion in debt. We're running $2.5 trillion deficits. And they play these silly games like, well, we're going to shut the government down if you don't give us X, Y, and Z. Nobody believes this stuff anymore. But anyway, they're shut down, but they might be not shut down by tomorrow. We'll see what happens. We'll all be sitting here with bated breath, of course, waiting for the big day. And what the issue is, and this becomes kind of an amazing thing, the President of the United States, President Donald Trump, is trying to enforce the law, which means if you sneak into the country illegally and we catch you, you have to go home back where you came from. And of course, President Clinton and President Obama and President Bush and all the presidents have been able to round up tens of millions of people who don't belong here and ship them back home where they belong. or at least somewhere else other than here, without any fanfare at all. But because it's President Trump, now the Democrats are totally hysterical because President Trump is trying to send a few million people back home. And we watch the silly games of Washington. And as you talk to the people on the street, and I'm traveling, I'm in a different state, I'm talking to people from sea to shining sea, the average American person, you can stop at the gas station, at the truck stop, or the cafe along the roadside. And you just ask people, What's your sense about Washington?" And it's the American. This is the one thing that unites all Americans. It's the eye roll. It's like, you gotta be kidding me. This is Washington, and this is how we govern. And I think what's going to happen, this is my opinion, of course, is that the states will have to begin to think about this idea of a Congress that does not serve the people. Rather, it serves its own political interests and its own obvious financial interests. When you start to look at the financial scandals we see in federal funding programs, started out with Minnesota, which seems to be a rather hotbed of social unrest. Now, I live in Wisconsin, and of course, the good Lord, in creating this beautiful earth, was wise enough to put the Mississippi River on the western side of Wisconsin and Lake Michigan on the eastern side. So it keeps Michigan over there and Minnesota over there. We have a little bit of an issue with the southern border with Illinois, but they behave themselves. But the point is, we sit here and we watch Minnesota. And by all metrics in Wisconsin, Wisconsin's a very eclectic place. It always has been. This is a place where cultures have come together and have built a society in Wisconsin that is very, very non-homogeneous. It's a very eclectic and diverse culture of people since the very beginning. It was lots of different Indian tribes, some of whom didn't get along with each other back in the prehistoric days. And then the French came floating down the Great Lakes and they started to set up colonies. And then the English showed up, and then the doors opened, and people from all over Europe piled in, predominantly German, Scandinavian, Irish, all sorts of Slavic peoples. Everybody piled in, even from the Great Migration of the South coming up very early in Wisconsin history. African Americans coming up from the South. So when we get to Wisconsin, it's a place, it's a very pleasant place, and people are very pleasant to each other, but there's always a sense of skepticism, or at least, I don't want to say paranoia, but there's always a little bit of a radar going on because of the fact it's been a diverse society since the 1600s or earlier. And unlike Minnesota, so when we from Wisconsin take a look at people in Minnesota, we think that's probably one of the most boring places on earth, pardon me. But it is. It's just sort of a homogeneous place. So it's very surprising to see the social turbulence that happens in a place that, by all intents and purposes, has always been perceived as being rather boring just west of the river, but it's not boring. And when you think about, it started out with the George Floyd situation, a horrible situation, and it has just snowballed and snowballed and snowballed to the point where we see like $9 billion in federal money that was allocated by our brilliant Congress, who can't count to three, or at least can't balance a checkbook, gives this money to the state of Minnesota, and $9 billion gets frittered away into fraud. And you think, wow, that's really crazy. And then, of course, they come in and they want to sweep up all the people who are here illegally and send them off on their way back home for free of charge. So no charge, get on the plane, we'll ship you back home. And of course, we are looking at what is, haven't seen in this society, in American society, at least since the 1960s, perhaps, which was driven by the Vietnam War and the civil rights movement. And before that, it was the Civil War back in the 1860s. So it is an unusual thing to see in such a boring place to have such turbulence. And it's a sad thing to watch, especially with the amount of fraud that is just perpetrated. So we watch that situation. And that's why we wonder from time to time, what in the world is the federal government doing? Who is policing it? And when the good guys, the Trump administration, show up to say, "Excuse us, but perhaps you shouldn't steal federal dollars," well, riots break out, shootings. It's bedlam. Don't tell me I can't steal from the Treasury. Who are you to deny my American right to steal from the American Treasury? This is where we are. And then, of course, when you look at California, now this is an emerging story over the weekend as well. It's quite an interesting story about this amazing ability to open a hospice in Los Angeles. And it's billions and billions of dollars being fleeced out of the system. And it's just wow. This is why the American citizens who are taxpayers, who are honest people who go to work and you pay your taxes and you live in your dinky little take home paycheck. You're thinking, you know what? Who's the fool here? We're the fools. And I think this is starting to come out in spades. So we're watching this, but this is a big problem with the federal government. And when you talk to your congressman there, there's nothing to do about it. You go in there. And that's why I think the states have to begin to analyze the American federal government and ask the question, 250 years in, is this good? Is it not good? I mean, do we just want to live in a kleptocracy where it's run by big institutional powers and interests in Washington, and we're all there's 50 colonies of the empire of Washington D.C., sort of like George III on steroids. We shall see. But I think politically, people are starting to really begin to ask those questions. And that's when social change happens. So we're watching that. And it's just, here we are. The government shut down today, even though it's never shut down. You cannot shut down the federal government. Anyway, so that's the news. We'll see tomorrow what happens. But I wanted to talk about something a little more relevant to the economy. And that, of course, is we have a new Federal Reserve chair that is going to be assuming power shortly. And a good pick, Kevin Warsh. He's a very interesting person, a great mind. He's a lawyer. That's always a good thing. But also his background, he is one of the younger Federal Reserve officers, but served on the Federal Reserve Board during the very important 2007 and 2008 crisis period. And I think from the perspective of who gets to run the Fed next, first of all, keep in mind that there's a chairman of the Federal Reserve System. And when you look at, and I've talked about this, if you subscribe to the Vault, you can find the Eastman Financial Report reruns. And I'm coming up on my third year of broadcasting, so you have to dig back early. But what you'll find are numerous times I've explained how the Federal Reserve is actually structured and why. And I will make a short analysis of that. But the point is, the Federal Reserve Chair is one of 7 governors of the Board of the Federal Reserve. Okay, and the chair has obvious extra duties, and Americans need somebody at the top. We got rid of a king who was at the top, and we replaced it with a president and a governor who's at the top. There's always has to be somebody at the top. Well, the person at the top is the chair of the Federal Reserve Board, and of course, Mr. Warsh is going to step into that role. But because of his experience in 2007 and 2008 during the financial panic, and that was a very serious panic. It was not something that we should. It will not go quietly into the past. It will remain of great concern to a lot of people on Wall Street, in finance and in banking and economics and in government, because we came really close to a major meltdown at that point. And he has experience in that. And that's where quantitative easing happened, where the Federal Reserve prints up money, goes into the bond market and buys bonds to keep the bond interest rates within a narrow band. That's what that's all about. So he is going to have some very good experience in managing that. And he's made public comments in the past about shrinking the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve, which means selling bonds into the market or letting them expire, and then taking money out of the market. When you sell a bond into the market and you get cash, you take the cash in, and the Federal Reserve cancels the money. It's kind of bizarre. Nobody likes to think about, burning up $100 bill, but in effect, the Federal Reserve has that power by law. You don't. If you burned up $100 bill, that's a federal crime. You shouldn't do that. But the Federal Reserve, through its monetary policy tools, has the ability to do it. So if he shrinks the balance sheet, and it's been, somewhere between $6 trillion, $8 trillion, $9 trillion at the high, if he wants to shrink that down and get the Federal Reserve out of the bond holding business, it'll be a good thing, but there will be financial ripples. And I have to take a break here, and I'll talk about some of those issues. So I'll be right back. Thanks.
Hello, I'm Brandon House. Would you like to gain access to over 20 years of my radio shows, TV shows, my books? I've written 15 books, and most of those books are ebooks now, and we have conference DVDs, conferences where we filmed our conferences at the Ozarks, literally starting 20 years ago. It's all available in our archived vault. All you have to do is go to worldviewtube.com/vault, worldviewtube.com/vault, and for a reasonable monthly fee, you gain access to over 20 years of Christian worldview programming, news, information, books, documentaries, and a powerful search engine. And folks, it's a great way not only to educate yourself, equip yourself, but it's a big way that you can help fund our continuation as a broadcast network. Please check it out. worldviewtube.com/vault, worldviewtube.com/vault, and help us continue pushing out a Christian worldview.
Okay, thanks for your patience. I'm back. So anyway, I'm assuming that Mr. Kevin Warsh will be a fantastic Federal Reserve chair, and his ideas of reducing the size of the Fed balance sheet is important because and the only reason the Fed has bonds on the balance sheet is not because the Fed runs around and buys a bunch of bonds and fiddles around. It's because the United States Congress continues to spend money that they can't raise from their taxpayers and tariffs and any other revenue. They spend vastly more money than they take in, and they finance the rest by selling bonds. And it's the Federal Reserve. And I've talked about this in the past, that when the Federal Reserve was created in 1913 and it went live in 1914, nobody could have imagined the massive federal debt of the United States government because power at that time was at the state level. And the federal government was supposed to raise and maintain an army and a navy. There weren't even airplanes back in those days. There was no Air Force. It was the Army and the Navy and the Marine Corps, of course. And that was the idea that the federal government would protect the colonies and, of course, the states from invasion by whoever decided they wanted to invade us. And, of course, run the post office, okay, and issue patents and trademarks and, that type of thing. We are so different today, and the Federal Reserve, in buying up all of these bonds, is doing nothing more than trying to keep the interest rates from going insane. If there was no Federal Reserve, and the Federal Reserve was not doing quantitative easing, they weren't buying up bonds to keep the bond interest rates between the bumpers, interest rates would be very, 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 very high right now because there's a massive outstanding debt of $38.5 trillion. And in order to keep interest rates in where they would like them to be for economic growth and stimulation, they have to keep buying more and more bonds out of the market to reduce the supply. If there's too much of anything, the supply is too high, the price comes down. And with a bond, it's a strange thing. Well, it's not a strange thing if you know math. It's an algebraic thing that as the price of a bond goes down, the interest rate goes up. So when the Federal Treasury wants to sell into a market and the interest rates are up, it costs more and more money, and it's pushing interest rates up. And the only reason interest rates haven't gone up rather dramatically is because the Federal Reserve steps in and keeps sopping up all the excess. And where do you get the excess from? The United States Congress is spending more money than they can bring in taxes and revenues. And that's the problem. So the Federal Reserve, being an independent organization, if it was truly independent, it could just basically say, we're not buying any federal bonds, which would have raised a major eyebrow before 2007 and 2008. I mean, the idea that the Federal Reserve would step in and buy stocks would have there were always rumors. There were always rumors that the Fed's, buying stocks because when they do that, they're reducing supply, and that's going to affect the market. And of course, if you tried this, the Securities and Exchange Commission would become knocking at your door because that's illegal. But the Federal Reserve has this monetary policy to keep things level. Well, how do you keep things level when the federal government is a spendthrift bunch of crazy? This is not good. We are not in a good situation. And that's why the states have to act and demand that the Congress of the United States, maybe it needs to be rethought or revamped, or maybe we go back to the old way where the Senate where was the senators represented the states. You see, back in the olden days when we drafted the Constitution, we the people didn't elect our senators. They were elected by the legislature and governor of the various and sundry states. And the Senate, if you look back in history, go back to merry old England while we were colonies, there was the Parliament, which was the people's house, and this came out of 1066, the Battle of Hastings, William the Conqueror, all of that, where the king wisely realized that if the people could debate and blow off steam in the Parliament, then they won't be revolting and chopping my head off. That was the idea of the House of Representatives in the United States. It was we the people's house. So, I've got 166,000 of us in my congressional district, and probably so do you. And all 166,000 of us who can't agree on much of anything send one poor soul off to Washington who's completely meaningless. That's how the system works. That was the people's house. But the Senate, back in the day when we passed the Constitution, it was ratified and became the law of the land in 1789. The Senate was a reflection of the House of Lords of England, where the House of Lords in England was a hereditary body of the king's buddies, and their job was to protect the crown. Okay, so if the people in the parliament got crazy and they started voting on all this stuff and pass all these crazy laws, the House of Lords could put the wet blanket on that to protect the crown. Well, that was the idea when we started the United States, under our Constitution. We'd have the People's House of Representatives, but then we would have the states. Each state would send two senators. All the states were equal, even though the populations weren't equal, and that was a big deal in trying to get to how do we govern ourselves. Well, the compromise was each state would send two representatives to the Senate, and then however many people there were, they'd send as many as they were apportioned. And then we had this bicameral house, you see, and unfortunately, this idea that we were going to elect our senators because this is a democracy, right? So the states lost all representation in the United States Congress. It's the people's House and the people's Senate. The problem is nobody's protecting the states. And I think the states are beginning to realize that. They certainly realized it in 2020 when there were 10 states that decided to sue other states because they were very concerned about the outcome of the election. And there was no representation. Of course, the Supreme Court shot it down. That was the end of it. But the point is, we are really looking at a dysfunctional federal government that's bankrupting not only itself, but all of us. And when you look at the economy in general, the upper tier is doing really well lately, but the other 90% of Americans are really starting to wonder. You're seeing social unrest, you're seeing vast amounts of just theft of federal dollars. And those aren't, so they'll say, well, those are tax dollars. Well, half of them are, but the other half are borrowed dollars. You think about that. It's not even tax money. It's, half of it's borrowed money. Who's going to pay it back? Who knows? Nobody will ever pay back $38.5 trillion. It will take generations to pay that down. Keep in mind, when we ended World War II, we had 127% debt to GDP. It was ridiculous. So Congress passed a 90% income tax rate for the top marginal bracket was 90%. It was very confiscatory. It took 30 years of that tax rate to pay that debt down to the point in 1975 where it hit the low water mark. But by that time, President Nixon had taken us off the gold standard. Inflation exploded, and we've been right back on that trajectory. So now, even without World War II or III, we're looking at a national debt that is higher than it was proportionally in 1945 after winning World War II. This is not sustainable. And I think this is something that the federal government's going to have to deal with because it's a really big problem. Okay, the second thing I wanted to talk about is the gold and silver. I participate in a number of chats on X and other places. And of course, a lot of people are stunned that gold and silver could have lost so much of its value in days. And of course, it's heading down again today. And the question I ask, well, first of all, the comment I make as a former financial regulator is one of the classic lines in our business was trees don't grow to the sky. And if you're an investor, you have to be very careful that you don't get caught up in the excitement, because I don't give investment advice ever, but there's some sort of common sense logic that what you want to do is buy low and sell high, and then you make a profit. If you buy high and then sell low, then you lose money. And I think a lot of people chase the price of gold and silver without really understanding those markets, and they're very complex markets. And keep in mind, there are two different prices and pricing mechanisms. There's physical gold and silver that's delivered from me to you. I have a gold coin and I give it to you and you give me Federal Reserve notes, which will never happen. I don't want Federal Reserve notes. But the point is that's a physical transaction. And why would you take gold or silver and convert it into Federal Reserve notes? Why would you do that? You converted them Federal Reserve notes to gold or silver. Why would you go back other than to grab some unless you had an immediate need for cash? And then there's the paper market. And the paper markets are for gold and silver are very much an illusion. There is so much more paper gold in existence, ounces of paper gold, than there are physical ounces of gold and silver. And if you don't understand that market, you can be whipsawed. And that's what we're looking at today. How can gold lose, 25, 30% of its value in a weekend? It's real easy because it's not physical gold, it's paper gold. And if you're speculating and gambling, you're going to find out the hard way. If you're the last one, if you're the last one to the dance as the band is starting to pack up and leave, you're going to not have a good time. And that's the big problem that we see in the marketplace because The gold and silver markets are very, very sophisticated, and gold markets are very much an international sovereignty type investment. Silver actually has some industrial commodity value, and that's why when you're in the silver market and you look at the price of silver collapsing, what you're seeing is a paper price. And what you're not seeing is the price paid to transfer physical silver from person A to person B, and the payment in dollars or euro or yen or whatever, renminbi. You have to be understanding that. So many people have decided to jump in and speculate. They're going to try to chase the market. You never win chasing the market. Now, will gold go back up? Maybe it will. Maybe it won't. You don't know. Markets go up and markets go down. But if you're going to play in that space, you need to do your homework and understand what you're buying and when and how. And also liquidity. It's very difficult to go to a coin store and say, give me spot for that. And I said, no, that's not how it works. The coin stores basically, they make their money by paying less than spot to buy inventory and then selling it above spot, and that spread is their profit. So you can't walk into a place, a retail place, and expect them to pay you spot. They're not going to do it. They're going to give you a discount. And if they're sitting on a pile of silver they can't sell because there's nobody coming in to buy, then they're not going to offer you much. And that's supply and demand. That's basic market pressures. And you need to understand that if you jump into these markets because they're volatile, and we'll see what happens. I'll be tracking that over the week. Well, that's all I have for today. I will be back tomorrow. It's so good to have you back. It's good to be back on the air, and we shall see what happens in the great economy that we live in. So, anyway, have a great afternoon, and I'll talk to you tomorrow. Bye.